Any way I can describe it is just a monster. A monster that would be up in the top corner of my bedroom window. It was outside. From the ground to that top corner is probably about 12 feet. And it would be like peering in around the corner in at me.
So, once again, you found yourself at the campsite of the Orator. Well, please pull up a chair. As you can see, the fire is stoked, which means I have another tale to tell. But before we begin, if you do find yourself enjoying this kind of content, first-hand accounts of the supernatural, paranormal, things that go bump in the night, please subscribe to this channel, like this video. That way you get notified every time I post new content. And it helps me to continue to do what I love, which is telling terrifying tales. Also, I do love interacting with my audience, so please comment below your favorite part of today's video, types of videos you'd maybe like to see in the future, or maybe you just have a question for me. Also, I'm always on the lookout for new stories, so if you have, or you know somebody who has, a first-hand paranormal encounter, please either comment below or find me on one of my socials and let me know you have a story. I would love to tell it on my channel one day. Next, our June and July contest is officially over. Thank you so much to everybody who commented. I'm super excited to get everybody's cards out and in the mail. That will be happening over the next couple days, so thank you so much for the support. And I'm really excited to partner with Jack's Attic again in the future and hopefully bring you guys some really cool new merch. And now, on to today's story. It is a tale that I like to call Cheerios and Candy Phones. So our story actually starts all the way back in the late 80s. Now at this time, Brittany is just a baby, and she has an older brother who's about 5 years older than her, and so he's right around 4 or 5 years old, and Brittany is still under 1 year old, so she's very, very young. Her parents are living in Lakeport, Michigan at the time, and they one day purchase an Ouija board. And you have to remember that in the late 80s, the stigma around Ouija boards just was not there yet. They were really considered just like kind of a fun evening. There was not all of the negative, scary energy that we kind of see nowadays. And so her parents buy this Ouija board and they play with it for quite a while, multiple nights where they're kind of playing with it and getting creeped out, but nothing happens. And then all of a sudden, one night, everything changes. There they are playing with the Ouija board. They're in their 30s. They're just a young couple having fun, and all of a sudden, the planchette starts to move on its own. They're asking all these questions, which is commonly how the game is played. You ask questions of the other side, and then hopefully you get some kind of response, or at least that's the concept behind the game. And so they're playing, and all of a sudden, the planchette moves. And the question they had asked is, are you a boy or are you a girl? And the planchette spells out neither. And remember, it does this on their own. So all of a sudden, they're a little bit freaked out, but they're also kind of excited because this is ultimately the goal of the Ouija board is to communicate with the other side. And finally, they feel like they've done that. And so they're trying to figure out, if this thing isn't a boy or a girl, well, what is it then? And so they ask, well, are you human? And it says no. And then they ask, well, if you're not human, then what are you? And all of a sudden, the planchette on its own spells out the word devil. Now, they're pretty creeped out by this point, and Brittany will later recount that her father was a real non-believer. No matter what happened to them, and plenty of crazy things did happen to this family, no matter what, he just was a staunch believer that it was all explainable, that there is no paranormal. And so, Brittany's mom at the time, she's super freaked out, and he's trying to play it cool. But deep down, he's probably very scared as well. And they continue to ask this devil, questions. And the next question they ask is, okay, so what do you want? What is it that you want? And the planchette spells out Tina, which is Brittany's mom's name. And so now they have kind of zeroed in on what this thing is looking for. And they say, well, what do you want with Tina? And the planchette spells out soul. It wanted Tina's soul. So right then and there, they end the game. They're both totally freaked out. They're trying to convince each other that, one of them moved the planchette or the other one moved it. And they're trying to convince themselves that it did not spell out all of that stuff on its own. And again, Tina, she is super freaked out, but her husband, he's kind of like reserved and thinks that this is maybe some kind of joke. But right away, weird stuff started happening. The very first thing that started happening was that Tina would wake up every single night at 3:15 a.m., almost on the dot exactly. Now, this is extremely significant, and most people probably already know this, but 3 a.m. to 4 a.m. is a concept known as the witching hour. Now, the witching hour, it has a ton of different mythology behind it as far as where it comes from. Some people obviously relate it to witches and things like that. The general common consensus is that 3 a.m. to 4 a.m. is the time where the spiritual barrier between the spiritual realm and the physical realm is at its thinnest. And so it's easiest for spirits to interact during that time. Now, again, ton of theories as to why that might be. Most common belief, at least in America, where Christianity is the largest religion, is that Christ died at 3 p.m., and the devil obviously works in antithesis, right? So he's always counter to anything that would be good. And so Jesus Christ dies at 3 p.m., then the devil works his magic best at 3 a.m., which is the exact opposite of that time. So regardless of sort of the backstory behind it, it is commonly believed that the witching hour, 3 a.m. to 4 a.m., is the time where spirits can kind of connect the most. And so Tina, she starts waking up every single night right smack dab in the middle of the witching hour. And she's really freaked out by this, especially because her husband works midnights. And so every single night, her babies are asleep, her husband is gone at work, and she's waking up at 3:15 a.m., and there's no reason for it. There's no sounds, there's no one in the house, there's nothing going on. She can't figure it out, but it's beginning every single night to happen. The other problem was that while Tina was asleep, she started having this recurring dream. And in this dream, there was this little boy. He was about 5-6 years old, so the same age as her son, and he would come up to her and want to have a conversation with her. And what was especially creepy about this boy, other than the fact that it was her son's age, which was kind of like emotionally taxing on her, was that he had no bottom half. And so his top half looked like a normal 6-year-old boy, and then sort of from the waist down, it just sort of faded away into nothingness. And every single time in the dream, her son comes up to her, and this other boy is already standing there, looking at her, and her son sort of introduces him. He says, "Hey, listen, Mom, this is my friend. He came here to see you. He came here to talk to you." And then every night she would wake up from this dream. It's 3:15 a.m., and she has no idea why she's just woken up. So after about 3 months of this kind of little stuff happening, they end up moving. They move from Lakeport, Michigan to Port Huron, Michigan. And the reason they were able to move into this new house is that Brittany's grandfather passed, and he was the one who owned the house, and he passed it down to Tina and her husband. And so they're all very excited. They decide to, move everything in. And Brittany remembers, now at the time, she is at this point maybe 2 years old, 2.5, maybe 3 years old. She actually has one of her earliest memories, which is the day they moved into this house. She remembers all of the moving trucks were there. They were getting everything moved into the house. And she sets eyes on this house for the first time. And the front yard has a porch connected to the house. And on the porch is a rocking chair. And this rocking chair was where her grandpa used to sit all the time. And as she's getting ready to walk into the house for the very first time, she looks over, and lo and behold, there's her grandfather sitting there rocking on the chair. He gives her a little wave. She smiles and waves back, and she continues on into the house and sees her dad and her uncle helping set up the stove together and stuff like that. So she has this full, complete, formed memory of when she was a little baby, and she sees her grandfather sitting there. And he was obviously deceased. He had been long since passed away, and there he is sitting in his favorite rocking chair, kind of greeting them as they come into the house. Now, this house is interesting. Tina's father, which is Brittany's grandfather, had owned this house for a really long time, and the house was built in the 30s. Now, at one point, Tina was actually doing some gardening out front, and she had sort of unearthed these older foundations of previous houses. So it looks like older houses were maybe pulled down, broken down, and then new houses were built over those old foundations. And so even though this property's only been around since the 1930s, it's very, very likely that older houses have existed in that same space before that. And Tina remembers growing up that house that her father had lived in, even back then, had a darkness to it. She remembers seeing shadows and feeling an overwhelming sense of negativity and darkness in that house. And so, years and years have now passed. They're getting ready to move back in, but she already knows that they might be in for a little bit of a ride here because she experienced that stuff when she was a kid. And now they've played with this Ouija board, and they are bringing a separate darkness into the house. So there's sort of two different things going on here. There's the stuff that already exists in this house, and there's this new, much darker entity that they are bringing in with them. Now, the house itself is pretty straightforward. You enter the front door, and you are immediately in sort of the living room area of the house. And that living room has one doorway forward into the dining room. And the dining room is basically the center of the house, and that's sort of where all of the other rooms split off from. So if you were to turn right out of the dining room, there's her parents' bedroom, and then there's the kids' bedroom. If you were to go left, you would enter the actual kitchen area. And then if you actually continue straight forward, there's this tiny hallway. One of the rooms out of the hallway is the bathroom, but then this hallway actually leads downstairs into the basement, and the basement was one big semi-finished room that had like laundry and stuff like that in it. And the basement is where a lot of this activity would end up taking place. So they move into the house. It's basically the very first night that they're there. Tina's husband goes to work like normal. He works the night shift. And Tina has put the kids to bed. Everybody's now asleep, and she decides to take a little bit of alone time and take a bath. So she's taking a bath, sort of relaxing, and then all of a sudden, she hears stomping up the stairs from the basement up into that hallway. And she gets super freaked out right away. She jumps out of the tub. She runs to their bedroom. She has a baseball bat in there. She pulls out that baseball bat. She throws open the door, and she's in that hallway that leads right down into the basement. So she turns, and she's looking, and the basement door is closed. And tentatively, she sort of sneaks over. She opens the basement door. She flips on the light. She goes downstairs. She's looking all over, and there's literally nothing at all down there. But she definitely heard the stomping. Now, obviously, she goes, she checks her kids. They're all asleep. That was clearly not where that sound was coming from. And she has no idea what's going on. But already, bad stuff is happening in this house. Now, this house had all of the typical staples that you would see in a haunted house. Every single member of the family saw the basic stuff. Shadows out of the corner of their eyes. They heard people walking around when it was not possible for people to walk around. That kind of stuff was so commonplace, Brittany says, that they just got used to it. It was totally normal to see shadows or to hear people or to even see different kinds of spirits throughout the house. Totally commonplace for them. So as for instance, they had a beagle, and sometimes it would be laying down on the floor, everybody's chilling, and the beagle would suddenly get up, look over at nothing, and start barking. And then something would happen to it, and it would start limping away. Even though it was totally healthy, it would suddenly have this limp as though it had gotten injured. Or her mother would be downstairs doing laundry in the basement, and all of a sudden she would hear the front door open and then slam closed. Now, these would be at times when nobody was home or just the kids were home, something like that. And so right away, she'd rush upstairs to see what was going on, and the door is still locked. And what was especially weird about this was a really old door, and it had these long glass panels that sort of ran the entire length of the door. And to cover those glass panels so people couldn't just look inside, they had this curtain that was hung up, and the curtains came down over the entire window. But when somebody closed the door, the sort of air circulation that would happen there would move that curtain, and it would sort of sit over the handle of the door. And so she'd hear the door open, she'd hear it slam, she'd come running upstairs to see what's going on. The door's closed and locked, but the curtain, which was previously down, is now hung up over the door handle, as though the door really did open and close, even though it's impossible and nobody's there. There would be times where the house was warm, it would be the middle of summer, everything was totally fine, and then there would all of a sudden be this sort of pocket of air. It wasn't a current, it was almost like this sphere of cold energy or cold air would float through, and people would feel it or feel it go through them. They would sometimes even breathe it, and it felt denser than normal air, and they would obviously get really freaked out by that. That was a very common occurrence. There was a time where Brittany was walking from the kitchen through that dining room area, and all of a sudden she felt sort of like a gentle push on her back. She says, it wasn't aggressive necessarily. It didn't feel hostile, but it definitely felt negative, like the whatever it was wanted her to sort of move along. Brittany remembers when she was maybe 5 years old, all the way through to maybe 7 or 8 years old, she had an imaginary friend named George, and George was somebody she could actually see, but the only time he would ever talk to her was if they were in her bedroom with the door closed totally by themselves, and then they could have conversations together. And, it was just an imaginary friend for Brittany, but for some reason Tina was really freaked out by George. She really didn't like the idea of George. And then later on, when they're adults, Brittany's sister has a son. So this is Tina's grandson. And one day he comes up to Tina and he says, hey, Grandma, just so you know, George says he wants to come and hang out, and he wanted to know if maybe he could come talk to you. And right away, Tina remembers George from all the way back when her daughter was a kid. And she's like, you know what, honey, tell George that I'm not really interested right now, and maybe we'll talk later. And hopefully she never hears from George again, because it really freaked her out. There were times where people would see doppelgangers of other people. So a doppelganger is basically an exact replica of somebody who already exists. So they look exactly the same. They're literally a carbon copy of that thing. And so there were 2 different times that there were doppelgangers in the house. So the first time that this happened, Brittany was in the dining room, and she sees her father come out of the living room area, through the dining room area, and walk into the kitchen. She doesn't really think anything of it, but then she walks from the dining room area into the living room, and her father is still sitting there. She says, didn't you just get up and I saw you walk into the kitchen? And he's like, no, I've been sitting here watching TV the whole time. And so she's freaked out by it. She runs into the kitchen. Nobody there. The second time this happened, so this is a little bit later, but Brittany is a little bit older, and she has now a younger sister. So she has a brother who's 5 years older. She has a sister who's 2 years younger. And her sister at this time has a boyfriend. And the boyfriend comes over, and they're kind of hanging out at the house. And Brittany is outside with her sister and her sister's boyfriend. And her mom, Tina, is inside. And Tina sees Brittany's sister's boyfriend walk into Brittany's room. And so she's a little bit confused as to why that would happen. So she walks over, kind of knocks, and then opens the door to see what's up. And there's nobody in there. The room's totally empty. And so she walks outside, and she sees Brittany and her sister's boyfriend all hanging out outside. And she asks the guy, hey, did you just come in and walk through the house or something like that? And he's like, nope, we've been hanging out outside this whole time. And so nobody could explain these strange doppelganger phenomenons. And then, of course, there was the incident with the candy phone. So Brittany, at the time, she's maybe 7, 8 years old, and she has one of these old toy candy phones. So these phones, they're made of plastic, but they're see-through, and on the inside, they have little pieces of candy, like Pez or different types of gumballs or things like that you could fill it with. And if you push the little rubber buttons on the front of the phone, they typically beep or light up and make noise, stuff like that. This was one of those phones. Super popular in the 90s. And so one day, she's sitting down on the rug playing with this phone, pretending to call people, and she decides she wants to page her father. So pagers, for those of you who don't know, were sort of the predate of cell phones. So this would be you don't carry a cell phone around, but somebody does need to get a hold of you and it's urgent. They would dial your pager number, and they'd follow it by pound and then some sort of number or name or something like that. And then you could look at that pager and identify the number and know who you needed to call back. So they'd call you. It would say, hey, let them know the number that they need to reach. You'd hit your number, and then their pager would start beeping, and then they'd look at it, and they would know who they need to get a hold of. So Brittany's father had a pager, and she had known his number and had actually paged him before, just in case there were emergencies and stuff like that. She knew how to get a hold of him. And so she's on the floor with her little candy phone, and she types in his pager number, and she waits the appropriate amount of time that it would take before she has to put in her number. Now, her number was #3. When it was pound 3, he knew that it was Brittany who needed help or needed him or whatever the case was. So she waits the appropriate amount of time, and then she hits pound 3, and after a couple seconds, his pager goes off. It starts beeping. He picks it up, he takes a look at it, and lo and behold, it says pound 3. So he's obviously very freaked out. Everybody's a little bit weirded out. And so they decide to try it again. Brittany dials the pager number. She waits for a couple seconds so it could give the input back. She puts pound 3. And once again, his beeper goes off. He pulls it out, pound 3. And so at this point, the guy's thinking, someone's obviously messing with me. Somebody's got a phone in another room, and they're just playing a prank or something like that. And he checks it out, and they're like, no, we swear this is no joke. And so they decide, let's try it one more time just to see. They give it one more shot. Dials the number, waits, pound 3. His pager goes off with pound 3. So her father takes the candy phone from her, and it is never seen again. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there were sort of two different types of energies that were in the house. There was the darkness that they brought with them. There was a little bit of darkness in that house also that was already there as part of that house. But there were also some kind of playful or helpful entities in the house as well. Oftentimes, these entities would show up in physical appearances. There was a spirit that Brittany and her sister saw pretty frequently. There's a little girl, she's about 6 years old, had blonde curly hair and an old-fashioned dress, like maybe something you'd see very frilly from the 1800s. And all the time they would see her walk up the stairs from the basement and out into that hallway before she disappeared. Always freaked Brittany's sister out a ton, but as Brittany got older, she just got so used to it, and it just wasn't a negative entity. She just saw this girl enough to where she kind of got used to it. There was an exception to this. One time, her and her mom were downstairs playing in the basement, and they were kind of playing like hide and seek and turning the lights off and kind of playing with each other. And then all of a sudden, Brittany flipped the lights on once, and she saw the girl right next to her on the stairs, and she shoves her mom aside, runs all the way upstairs, and is totally freaked out and explains to her mom, I saw the girl. She was right next to me. And her mom's like, I was down there with you, and I didn't see her. And Brittany's like, well, I don't know what to tell you. She was literally right next to me. And so that freaked her out. But for the most part, that was one of the spirits that was just never malicious, just always present in the house. There was another one that was a young boy. He was maybe 5, 6 years old, and he was just a mischief maker. He would take things, move things, replace things, knock things over. You'd maybe be looking for your keys. They're not where you left them. You'd leave the room, come back, and then all of a sudden, they're exactly where you thought they were, and they were not there 5 seconds ago. That was the kind of mischief he liked to play. But it was never anything super malicious, just a kid kind of playing pranks. They saw that spirit quite a bit. They would frequently find dimes in the center of the room. So they would pick it up, they'd walk out, they'd come back in, another dime sitting in the center of the room. Happened all the time to all of them, constantly seeing dimes. Never nickels or quarters or anything like that, always dimes. Now, if you're not familiar, this is actually a spiritual phenomenon. There's a lot of history behind it, a lot of different theories, but basically it is supposed to be something about the spirits communicating from the other side. And there are a lot of different theories, but the general overwhelming theory is them trying to say, it's okay, keep doing what you're doing, things are going to turn out all right. The symbol of the dime means things are going to come full circle, and so don't worry about it, everything's coming around as it should. But that was something that they experienced all the time. And then there was the time where Tina and Brittany were outside. They're just sort of hanging out, enjoying the day. It's really nice weather. And all of a sudden, their inside phone rings. Now, this is a landline phone. It's not a cell phone. And they had an answering machine. And back then, when you had these answering machines, how it worked was if you called somebody and you got their answering machine would actually take over. And if you wanted to call them back, you had to wait for the answering machine to make its full cycle before you could recall. If you tried to call them too early and the answering machine was still going, you'd get a busy signal as though the line was taken over, which it was by the answering machine. And so they're outside, they hear the phone ring, they don't want to try to run in to get it, so they're like, let's just send it to the answering machine and we'll listen to it later and see who it was. And all of a sudden, right before it would get to that answering machine, the phone stops ringing and immediately starts ringing again, which shouldn't even be possible. And so they're a little bit weirded out by this, but they listen to it ring, and then it does it again. It stops right before the answering machine would take over, and then once again they hear the ringing. And so this time they're like, what the heck is going on? They run into the house, and they run over to the phone. They pick it up. There's nothing there. But when they're in the house, they all of a sudden have the smell of gasoline is in the air. And so they're like, what the heck is going on? And Tina had lit some candles in the living room, and the whole house is starting to smell like gas. And so she immediately runs into the kitchen, which is the only place where gas should be leaking out of. And what had happened was their dog, the beagle, had jumped up onto the stove. And when he did it, he accidentally hit one of those knobs. It turned enough to start releasing gas, but not enough to ignite that flame and actually start the stove. And so gas was literally pouring out all over to their house. And somehow, some entity called through their phone to alert them to it. And so not everything, was a malicious entity. There was often times where you'd be just sitting in the house and all of a sudden there was an overwhelming smell of flowers, this floral smell. And every single person in the house said, it just made them feel very comfortable, very at ease. It was clearly not a natural smell. It wasn't something like there were flowers sitting on the table or something like that. It was very strong. It had no origin, no source where it would come from. And yet it immediately put whoever was smelling it at ease and they felt really good. Then there was the Cheerios incident. So Brittany and her sister are in their room. They're maybe 8, 9, 10 years old, so they're still pretty young. And they're in there in the bedroom just laughing up a storm. And Tina hears them and she's just kind of curious as a mom, what's causing them to laugh this hard and have this much fun. And she opens up their bedroom door and they're sitting in this circular pile of Cheerios. And she's like, where the heck did these Cheerios come from? We don't have Cheerios in the house. And all of a sudden, from the ceiling, it's literally like Cheerios are coming through the ceiling and raining down into the bedroom. And Tina is obviously extremely freaked out by this, but she doesn't want to freak her daughters out. And she's like, oh, that's great, kids. Come on, let me clean it up. And so she obviously gets them. They get them out of the house. They're really freaked out, but she goes in, she cleans everything up. And that was the only time that the Cheerios incident had happened. And then there was the time with the old lady. So Brittany and her sister, who was a couple years younger than her, they're actually in the dining room area. And in that dining room, there was sort of one of these old tables sitting there. And on the table was one of these big mirrors, these big oval mirrors. And they're getting ready for the day together. Brittany's a little bit taller, and so she can kind of just stand right behind her sister and do their hair together and stuff like that. They're there just kind of hanging out, doing their hair, a normal day. And all of a sudden, Brittany looks in the mirror, and she sees this old lady standing behind her. And she taps her sister on the shoulder and says, do you see that? And her sister freaks out, and they both turn around, and there's nothing there. But when they turn back into the mirror, she's still standing there. She's in her 80s, so she's a little bit older. She's starting to thin out a little bit. Her hair's straight, maybe shoulder length, and kind of wiry. And the girls obviously are freaked out. They get the dog, and they run outside with the dog, and they literally just wait there until their parents get home. Mom and Dad show back up. They explain exactly what happened. And as it turns out, Tina remembers this lady. This is the lady that her father, so Brittany's grandfather, bought the house from. This lady used to own it. He was a neighbor. He ended up purchasing the house from her. But from what they described, this sounds exactly like that lady who did end up living right next door and passed away living right next door. And so she's like, yeah, that's what that sounds like. And so there were all of these different kind of common spirits that they saw all the time in the house, so often that it was sort of commonplace and normal, but they were never very harmful. Unfortunately, there was a much darker entity in that house. Now, nobody knows if this was already at the house or possibly this is the thing that Tina had brought with her, but there was something that made everything else seem very, very tame by comparison. This thing dwelled in the basement. Now, the hallway to that basement is only about 15 feet long, but Brittany says to this day, if you go in that house, that hallway is unnaturally dark. There should be sunlight that pours into that hallway, and so you should be able to see down it. And yet, you could be there in the middle of the day, and that hallway can be as black as pitch. And so the hallway was always kind of dark and freaky, and it led right downstairs into the basement. Anytime anybody was in the basement, they said it felt like a constant assault. They said from the moment you walked into that basement, it felt like something was not just staring at you and giving kind of that creepy hair standing up on end vibe. They said it felt like something was running at you. Like the moment you walked in there was something hostile staring at you. And they saw all sorts of creepy stuff in the basement. Shadows, things moving around, stuff like that. There's one time Tina was doing laundry. She looked over and she saw this bright white face in the corner of the basement just staring at her out of the darkness and freaked her out. A lot of the spirits had lived down there and were kind of moving around down there. And so there was a lot of darkness happening in that basement. But the darkness was not contained to just the basement. Terrible things were happening all over that house. Brittany remembers one time she's sitting in her bedroom, and all of a sudden, all four walls at the same time feel like someone's pounding on the walls. Not just knocking, but literally slamming their hands against all the walls. It was so bad, she thought maybe some sort of earthquake or something was happening. And so she runs out of her room, through the dining room, and out into the living room where her parents are sitting. And she's like, what is going on? And her parents are like, what are you talking about? And she's like, you didn't just hear that? All of a sudden, every single wall in the house was getting banged on. She's like, my whole room was surrounded by people. And her parents are like, we literally didn't hear anything. And so obviously that freaked her out, made her not really want to sleep. There was a time where Brittany and her sister were in their bedroom, and her mom had bought them a recorder. So it's one of these old tape deck recorders where you take one of these little tapes, you put them in the box, and then there's a red record button. You can click it and record your voice, and then you could obviously play it back and stuff like that. And they're playing with this thing in their bedroom. And basically what they did is they would hit record, and they would sing a song together. They'd stop the recording, they'd rewind it, and then they would listen to themselves singing a song. It was just something fun that they were doing. And so they were in their bedroom. They're singing Mary Had a Little Lamb together. They sing the song. They're loving it. They're laughing. They stop. They rewind it all the way to the beginning. They push play. Here they are singing Mary Had a Little Lamb. And then all of a sudden, this deep, dark voice says, "Shut the up." And so they're really weirded out by this, but they're really young and they're not really freaked out by it. And so they think it's kind of funny. They take it to Tina and they say, Mommy, look at this. Look how crazy this is. And they rewind it. They push play. It's them singing. The dark voice comes on, says, "Shut the up." And their mom doesn't want to freak out in front of them, but again, very disturbed, just like the Cheerios incident. And so she says, yeah, that's really cute, honeys. Let me see that real quick. And she takes it, and she tells them to go play something else outside, and she disposes of that tape recorder. This dark entity also manifested itself physically. And anytime it manifested itself physically, it was always dark shadow that sort of looked like smoke moving around. And what was especially weird about this thing was that it would take on a different visage depending on who it was going after. And it always seemed to find the thing that freaked them out the most. And then that's kind of what it would morph into. So, for instance, Brittany's sister, she was terrified of certain types of animals. And that's exactly what this thing would do. It would turn into different big animals. And it would literally run through the walls of her bedroom and at her. And, obviously freaked her out. It would chase her throughout the house. She'd see them in the dead of night. She would all of a sudden wake up in the middle of the night, no clue what's going on, and all of a sudden she'd see these shapes coming through her walls or out of her closet or under her bed after her, and it was just a constant terror to her for years and years. Brittany saw this thing in a completely different light. So Brittany is in her bedroom, she's asleep in her bed, and she would wake up, and again, this would happen for years. And she'd look out her window. Now, her window is at the base, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall, but it is a pretty tall window. And she said the height of the window is probably around 12 feet tall. And she would see this dark shadow outside, fingers wrapped around the windowsill. And this thing is so tall, it's literally peering down and looking at her from the top of the window. And this thing would stare at her with bright red eyes. And it would blink and it would move around to let her know that it was not just standing there, that it was looking to do something menacing. Now, all of these things are happening for years and years. They moved into that house when Brittany was about 2 years old, and her parents still live there to this day. Thankfully, things changed a little bit. Now, this came about because her parents, when they moved into that house, all of a sudden they started arguing like crazy. Something they had never done before. In fact, Tina made it a point that she would never argue in front of her kids, but her and her husband, they were just getting more and more at odds. She remembers her husband saying he just continued to get more and more stressed out. He was getting angry over the littlest things. Their kids would speak when he was trying to talk, and instead of just being calm, because that's what kids do, he would freak out. He would yell at Tina for the oddest things, and he recognized that his temper was getting worse and worse, and he just couldn't explain it. He's like, I don't know what's going on with me, but I can tell that I'm blowing up over these little things, and I just can't help it. And it actually got so bad that Tina and him got into this massive argument, huge fight right in front of the kids, which Tina swore she'd never do. And at that moment, she said, you know what? We can't do this anymore. You gotta get out of here. We gotta maybe take some time apart. And so they ended up separating, and he went and lived somewhere else. And within a week of leaving that house, he immediately felt better. Everybody said he completely changed back into the guy that they remember. He didn't have that darkness over him. He stopped getting angry right away. And so, Tina and her husband, they realized, they came together and said, we have to do something about this. And so at that point, they started setting about trying to solve this problem. And for years, they tried to solve it. They would bring the church in and have the church, bless the house. They would bring in different sages and things like that. Literally anything they could think of to get rid of this darkness. And then the night that they had this huge fight and they were getting really sick of everything going on, Tina dropped to her knees. She had been attending church as a Jehovah's Witness, and so she literally dropped to her knees and she started praying to Jehovah. She said, we can't do this anymore. My family cannot keep going through this. You need to come down. You need to protect this house. You need to get rid of these evil entities. We don't know what else to do. And from that moment on, not everything cleared up. To this day, there's still darkness in that house and weird things happen. And Tina still calls Brittany, almost nightly and says, tonight I saw this, or I saw this shadow, or the green shadow was back, or the black shadow was back. She still sees all sorts of stuff all the time. But that really dark entity, the thing that was driving people to anger, the thing that was really scaring everybody in the house, thankfully, since she prayed, that thing has been removed from their house and nobody has had problems with that. And so they still live in that house. There's still darkness inhabiting that house for sure. But fortunately, for everybody involved, it is something that they've been managing for a long time, and they're very used to it, and they feel very comfortable living there. So that's going to do it for today's story. If you enjoyed today's story, or you enjoy this kind of content, firsthand accounts of the supernatural, paranormal, things that go bump in the night, subscribe to this channel, like this video. It will give you updates every single time that I post new content, and it helps me to continue to grow my channel and to continue to do what I love, which is telling terrifying tales. Also, I do love interacting with my audience, so please comment below favorite part of today's episode, types of episodes you'd like to see in the future, question you might have for me. And also, if you do have a story, or somebody has a story, a first-hand account of the supernatural or paranormal, please either reach out here in a comment or message me on one of my social media platforms, and I would love to hear from you, and I would love to tell your tale one day. I do want to give a special shout out to the subject of today's story. Her name is Brittany. She actually has her own YouTube channel. It is called randomness_with_Brittany. I will link it below. She's got a ton of different content with her and her husband. Thank you so much, Brittany, for the story. She's actually going to tell her own version of these events on her channel in a slightly shorter format. Thank you again, Brittany. Super excited. Go check out her channel, guys. And as always, I appreciate it. And so that's going to do it. Until next time, where you will please pull up a chair, the fire will be stoked, and I'll have another tale to tell.